Today's gospel is a continuation of last week's, which was a continuation of what happened the week before. And yeah, you guessed it, which was a continuation of what happened the week before. We are in the middle of what scholars call the bread of life discourse from John's gospel. When we get to next week, we will have taken 5 weeks to traverse through one chapter. The beginning of the journey through the 6th chapter of John started with a feeding. The crowds were seeking and following Jesus around the countryside. And then, out of the blue, it seems that Jesus was inclined to feed all those that showed up. I suppose it was like Woodstock. No, not that little yellow bird in the Snoopy cartoon. The festival, that music festival in upstate New York. Now, the 1969 version, the original version. Woodstock was up in the middle of nowhere upstate New York. The original design for the festival was much more modest than what actually occurred. The cars and the people just started arriving. And then more cars and more people, and so on and so on. Way more than what was planned for, and way more than what should have been there. And if you are of a certain age, you all know someone who says they were there, whether they were really there or not. So the crowds end up unexpectedly following Jesus around. And this whole discourse starts off with a young boy's offering of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus fed thousands that showed up just by giving thanks to God for the provision and then feeding the crowd until they were satisfied. Now, as we make our way in this world, teaching the gospel through word and deed, it might do us some good to remember that before Jesus taught the crowd, he fed them. He met their physical needs so that the food for the mind and the soul would be able to be consumed as well. So after Jesus feeds thousands, the crowds chase after Jesus, and they want more from him. They want more bread. But Jesus does the Jesus thing, and he pivots. Jesus doesn't give them more bread, at least not the physical kind. He starts to teach about the bread of life. And for us, for the past few weeks, Jesus has been teaching us just like he taught the crowds. The people had tried to reduce the gospel to food distribution and political power. Jesus was far more radical than that. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. Now, John tells us the Jews had a problem with Jesus' declaration to the crowd. Now, just a side note here. When John uses the term Jews, they weren't the enemy. John uses the term as a way of identifying those that would stand in opposition to Jesus. And we don't know exactly who they are because John doesn't tell us exactly who they are. John knows who they are, and it's his own shorthand for him. Now, we suspect they're the religious elites, but one thing is for sure. They are not enemies to be defeated or denigrated. They are not people to be defeated. And while in this passage, they are the ones who question Jesus and what he means, I think we should be more hesitant to cast our own aspersions on them when all we need to do is wait until next week to hear about his own disciples doing the exact same thing. Now back to Jesus. The people start talking about this confusing and hard saying of Jesus. What does Jesus mean? Bread that is his own flesh? And Jesus delivers an intentionally hard saying, and he puts it all out there. He drives it home, and he does it with graphic language, and he forces the issue. He pushes people so far that they can no longer believe that he is talking about food distribution and political power. Jesus resists the easy explanation that the gospel only has a horizontal quality to it. And he starts the debate. He gets the people thinking, what can this all possibly mean? Jesus is not afraid to say something so repulsive to their vocabulary. The bread of life is his flesh and blood. The religious elites question and wonder what all this means. How can this man give us flesh to eat? How can Jesus advocate for the drinking of blood, his blood? Something expressly forbidden by the Torah. How can flesh be bread? How can this be? Jesus' saying is hard to understand, and he will not neuter it to make it more palatable for the people. It might just be time for them to rethink the literal. Time to rethink just a plain reading of the text. The religious elite echo the same question Nicodemus had just a few chapters before this. They echo Mary when the angel told her that she would be the mother of the chosen one. How can this be? I dare to say that we are of the same mind. How can this be? Jesus tells us the same thing 6 times today. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Whoever eats me will live because of me. The one who eats this bread will live forever. Now, I don't think Jesus is repetitive because he has forgotten what he said. I don't think he's rambling as much as we'd like to think he's rambling on here. It's the same thing over and over again because it's important. But not only important, he repeats himself 6 times today because of the difficulty of what he is trying to communicate. It's not easy to understand. This is not simple. And our efforts to make it simple reveal a lot about ourselves. Maybe it's our own time to rethink the literal. It's as if Jesus knows that what he is talking about today rubs against our natural inclination, goes against our accustomed ways of understanding, going against the ways that we make sense of this world. It's as if Jesus knows that he needs to be redundant and repetitive. It's as if Jesus needs to be a battering ram at our castle doors of our hearts and our minds, and he needs to keep on hammering away at our cognitive defenses until we comprehend when he says bread, he is not talking about flour and water and yeast. We live in a modern world where we love statements like, this is only, this is just. We love those simple statements. This is only bread. This is just another day in the office. This is only a Jew from Nazareth. Jesus is directing us towards something more when we start with the phrase, this is only. Jesus is pulling us into ourselves. As a culture and society, we live disconnected from each other, and we especially live disconnected from our own selves. We medicate ourselves to stop feeling and seeing and sensing that there is more in this world. We medicate with alcohol or sex or drugs, money and work, politics. And especially we medicate ourselves with the little devices that we keep so close to us at all times. Jesus is pointing us to something beyond bread, pointing us beyond bread to incarnation. And we were warned by John very early on at the beginning of his gospel. The Word became flesh and lived among us. This idea that God became flesh, this idea of incarnation, the incarnation is so against our natural, normal expectations for what is spiritual and religious. We long ago jettisoned the mystical, and we struggle to recapture it. The incarnation is so profound that Jesus must reiterate time and time again that flesh, that life in this world is exactly where God deems to meet us. And Jesus keeps raising the stakes throughout this whole discourse, starting with physical bread and then explaining and telling us more and more, helping us experience the incarnation with our own eyes and with our own hands. He is bread, he is flesh to be eaten, and blood to be drunk. And we aren't called to follow Jesus, just follow Jesus, which in and of itself is hard to do. We aren't simply called to be with Jesus. Jesus calls us to consume him. Now, for some of us, we can distance ourselves from the subject that we're thinking about. We take an objective stance, and we are cool and calculated, and we tuck our emotions away with the goal of dispassionate reasoning about a subject. Jesus won't let us do that today. Today, we think about and experience the Word made flesh through ingestion and consumption and intimate, deep engagement. There is no knowing Christ fully without visceral, total engagement. We will not fully know or comprehend him by keeping him at arm's length, far away from our lives. We will not know him by sitting back, comfortable in a pew and coolly considering him as if he were an abstract, disembodied idea. Incarnation means we must get up, come forward, hold out empty hands, gnaw at the bread, and gulp at the wine that Jesus offers in our lives. Our notions of God can be more intellectual than physical. We love the idea of a God who is far away, a God of justice that is kept at arm's length, a God of holiness and righteousness that wouldn't dare walk a world corrupted by sin and death. And the world is repulsed by the idea that this God of the universe, this God that created all that is seen and unseen, would become our flesh and blood, fully divine and fully human. It is an idea that is repugnant to the world. Wouldn't the Christian faith be easier if it was just a matter of belief? Wouldn't it be easier if the Christian faith was just a matter of intellectual assent? Today, Jesus won't let us do that. Jesus pulls our faith down out of our heads on a journey to our hearts and to our very beings. No, today's rather scandalously carnal, incarnational gospel reminds us that Jesus intends to have all of us, body and soul. His truth wants to burrow deep within us to consume us as we consume him, to flow through our veins, to be digested, to nourish every nook and cranny of our being. A theology professor at Oxford says that the toughest task for his students in his class is to ask and answer the question, what is theology about? Now, his students will answer that question about that theology is about spiritual matters, or about religion, or a deeper meaning of life, so on and so forth. Instead of accepting these answers, he will instead teach his class that theology is about everything. Jesus has come down from heaven with the intention of taking it all back. He not only wants all of us, he wants us all. And he wants us to have all of him. This is the incarnational God, and this God is so scandalously, intimately available to us all. Thank God for that. Amen.